Welcome, thinkers, to Season 4, Episode 8 of Thinking Critically. I hope you're all enjoying the new 2-weekly schedule. It's been a lot easier for me, so I really appreciate your patience between episodes. If you like what I do, you can always check me out on Patreon or Ko-fi. I know I say it at the end of the episode, but this time I'm front-loading it. So yeah, links to both of those can be found on the website at thinkingcritically.co.uk. And the other thing to plug, which I don't do enough, is I'm also part of an actual play podcast called Dungeons, Dice and Dudes. So you can find links to that on my website as well in the footer. So head over there and then you can listen to me play as well. Otherwise, let's get on with the show. And today I'm joined by Nick. Thank you ever so much for joining us today, Nick. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name's Nick. I'm the host of the Hidden GMs Podcast. It's an interview show for game masters where I search the community for GMs with successful and interesting campaigns and interview them in a casual one-on-one format. My guests come from a range of backgrounds, all levels of experience, from new DMs who just wrapped up their first campaign to actual play podcasters to pro DMs with decades behind the screen and everybody in between. I recently had the pleasure of joining Dan Lowe on Negative Modifier's Extra Life charity stream, where we played a Tales from the Loop scenario, GM'd by Charlie, aka Mordak, the host of Negative Modifier. I've been GMing since middle school. I have about 23 years of off and on experience with role-playing hobby. I've played about 24 role-playing systems and GM'd many of those, and currently I'm running 3 campaigns: a heavy metal themed campaign set in my own homebrew world in 5th edition. I have a Fallout campaign also homebrewed set in Canada, and a play-by-text mothership campaign set in a derelict research vessel.
Wow. Okay. So a lot of experience. The one thing I wanted to pick up on there is, yes, we met on the Negative Modifier charity stream, and I know you said Charlie, aka Mordak. I know we joked about it at the time, but I also want to say, for full disclosure, I also thought it was like Mord 4K until that recording. So
yes, it does read like Mord 4K.
Yep, good. So I feel like I've been sitting on that for so long, so now I'm happy to get it out there.
Confession received.
Today's topic is experimenting. So what does that mean to you in the D&D and wider TTRPG framework?
To me, experimenting can kind of just be summed up by saying trying new things. I mean, that could be new approaches and techniques, taking risks, the whole process of finding your play style, whether that's as a DM or as a player, just through trial and error. Experimenting with different settings or even different game systems, all of those things can be included. And an experiment could be as simple as trying a new race class combination, or it could be something where you change how you think about role-playing at a fundamental level. And it's just kind of exploring the hobby.
Mm-hmm, yeah, I like the variation in scope there, from the micro of like, ooh, let me try this new item, all the way up to, as I want to talk about now, let me try a completely new system. So right. Going into that special Negative Modifier charity stream, I was a bit anxious because I had told Charlie when we were obviously talking about it in the preamble, I was like, hey, just to let you know, like, I've never played this. Like, you're going to need to do some hand-holding. So that was very much, for me, an exercise in experimenting with a completely new TTRPG system.
Yeah. Was that your first system that wasn't D&D, or have you played some others?
Prior to that, I had played, in the loosest connotation there, Fiasco, which I know isn't really a TTRPG, it's more of a party improvisation game. Mm-hmm. So I played Fiasco. With friends of the show, Tabletop Journeys, I played Against the Dark Master for, again, I jumped on their channel for a bit. We had one game with the makers of Against the Dark Master. And I have the Alien rulebook, but I have not played it. I just love reading it. And that may well have been it, yeah. So going into Tales from the Loop, I had no real idea, and
Sure.
that was a lot to pick up. So like, obviously my bread and butter, my long term is D&D 5e, right? Which has, for all its pros, it has many drawbacks. I think it's fair to say.
It's purpose built for sure. What do you think you got out of like experimenting with those other systems? Did it affect how you think about D&D or how you play?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe not. It hasn't been long enough yet for that to filter through to how I play. Certainly not in the middle of the chapter that we're in. But in terms of thinking about how other TTRPGs can be played, yeah, absolutely. Like the next morning, I was thinking about Tales from the Loop, and I think I messaged my friends and was like, "Hey, I played this last night, and it was really cool." And it was a piece of cake for me to pick up in having never played it before. That's definitely something we could do, because I find, maybe it's just the way I run my D&D games, but it's also the ones I play in the devil is in the details. It's very, microscope is on everything. It's very minutiae. It's very like, I want to walk here. Okay, that will take you 5 minutes. What's everybody else doing in that 5 minutes? I want to look in my bag, roll me an investigation check to dig through your bag. Like, it's very, I don't want to say clunky, because that is a negative connotation, but it is very focused on the moment to moment minutiae of what that particular character is doing.
Yeah, it sounds like your current experiment with your style is that you are kind of leaning on the system to resolve detail instead of hand waving it.
Yes.
And a lot of the like more narrative driven ones will lean on just your capabilities as an improviser and narrator, and less so on your reliance on the structure of the system.
Yeah, that was really, really highlighted to me as the best way to learn, because I was in the process of contributing to it, not just a passive observer. And the one thing that really, there's the meme in D&D 5e, right? It's don't split the party, because it's dangerous in universe sense, but also it's a pain in the backside for the DM to manage two disparate parties. And the thing that really hit me with Tales from the Loop was when one of the guys was like, I go to the video store to see if there's any videos to rent. And I was like, oh, you can do that? That's just, I can just go and somewhere else and suddenly be somewhere else and it be fine and be on this completely different thing, and no one is freaking out about it. that was my light bulb moment when I was like, this is a different way to play here. This is a completely different way to play TTRPGs. This would never happen in any of the D&D games I play in. That would be immediately well, that's going to take you 3 hours. What's everybody else doing for 3 hours? Well, I do this and I do that.
I think a lot of those, like, kind of the conventional wisdom that we've collected from playing hours and hours of these games, it's like never split the party is almost like it would be on one of those live, laugh, love posters. It's like, one of your 10 commandments of D&D. But I also think that experimenting is trying to responsibly break those rules. So how can I split the party and do so in a way that's still compelling for the players who aren't in the scene? How can I do it in a way that still accounts for time and it doesn't put the party in immediate jeopardy? Or if it does it do it in a compelling way? So I think those rules are great guidelines, but as you kind of continue to experiment, you find ways to break those rules in interesting ways.
Yeah, it's definitely a platitude, or as I said, a meme. Like it's gone around so much so that it's now a joke rather than a genuine like a genuine piece of advice in some instances. But yeah, that was the real bit where I was like, oh, okay, I see now why this is different, and I can see now the draw that these narrative style TTRPGs have over what everybody now considers the TTRPG, D&D 5e, how mainstream it is.
Would you ever consider kind of like leaning a little less on the minutia at any point, and just kind of doing a little bit more hand waving and getting a little bit more loosey goosey, kind of like these more narrative driven systems in your 5e games? Or do you think that the strength of the 5e system is that that it supports your style?
I've already started to move away from being so precious about what's happening moment to moment. I've already started to train myself into moving away from like the information goblin and I can't let my players know anything and they need to roll and this, that, and the other. I've already taken those steps to be like, no, it's just going to be quicker and easier if I just say, this about this, and that's it. Like, no rolling. And now we'll straight back with the players. and it's their agency and it's their story, and so I've already started to make those steps. The problem, no, not a problem. The situation I find myself in is that several of my players are quite mechanically focused. So they love a traditional dungeon crawler. They love the bigger numbers that get bigger and do more damage, and they take less damage. That's their bread and butter. So I'm kind of restricted a little bit in scope as to how much I can push up against that boundary there before they go, oh, this is now uncomfortable territory for me, and this is not the D&D that I signed up for.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's important to know your audience and kind of know your players, and don't give anyone whiplash by changing your style in the middle of a campaign too much. So I can see why that. I don't know. I think that it sounds like your players and you would be are a great pairing. Like sometimes it's hard to find a table that plays the way you want to play, and it sounds like I don't know, maybe you struck gold there.
No, well, no, I'm not about to say that I'm the person who's found the unicorn, for sure. It's harder for everybody, not just myself, to find that balance. We have some players who are only there just for the social element, and we have some players who are there for the role play, and we have some players who don't like to do role play at all. So there's overhead on everybody to balance all of that out. So it's you'd probably have more mileage, or overall maybe perhaps more enjoyment if you had 4 of the same styled players rather than 5 sometimes quite radically different players. But in a way that comes together to make its own beast that everybody enjoys. So but what about yourself then? What about your players and your games? Because how many games did you say at the beginning?
I'm currently GMing 3. I've got my heavy metal themed D&D campaign, which is an in-person game with 3 players. And then I've got a virtual game, which is my Fallout 2D20. It's the Modifius system. That system's a lot of fun. And the way that even between those 2 games, the way that I run them is very different, and the types of experiments I run while running those games are wildly different. And then I have a third game, which is just between me and my sister, where we play over text, and it's the Mothership system, which is a sci-fi horror system it's incredibly efficient. It's about a 35 to 40 page manual that looks like a little fan magazine. It's about that big. I made a small book shape with my hands for the benefit of the listener. And in those 40 pages, they give you all the tools you need to run an effective sci-fi horror game that has, pretty robust mechanics. And I would not describe it as rules light. Mm-hmm. And it's the economy of words and the economy of space in that book is commendable. And I've run both that and I've run Alien, and I love both of them for different reasons. But I'm like, how come it takes this giant tome to make Alien work, and then I can almost do Alien in Mothership system with 40 pages of information? Mm-hmm. It's wild.
I've got the Alien starter set, so my rule book is only like a centimeter thick. Luckily, I've seen the real one though, and it is like a 2 inches thick. And I do love the starter set rule book because it's like a work of art, as in there are literal just double spread pages which are just a picture with the title of the chapter on, which I think that's so gorgeous. The art in that is great. But it's really weird because you said you wouldn't describe Mothership as rules light, and then that got me thinking that there are rules light systems that are like, on a single page, for example, on itch.io or something. You can find 100 which are just like, here's 4 stats, roll a couple of d6s, here's what happens in the game, go ahead and do some weird and wacky stuff. And then you have something in the middle like Mothership, and then you have the beast, which something like D&D has grown into now, where you have 3 quote-unquote core books,
right?
Which arguably sometimes you need 3 of them, sometimes you don't even need 1 of them. And then if you start to include all the splat books, you're up to God knows how many pages and pages and pages of books. And again, it begs that same question of like, hang on, whoa, let me pump the brakes a little bit. Why do I need like £300 worth of books?
Yeah, I agree. I think that not only are the amount of pages needed to convey a system or a setting so different, but also just kind of the room that you have to play as a player or your room to experiment as a game master are also just as varied. It's like in D&D, I find a lot of my experiments are related to either encounter design or how I actually, approach running the table. Whereas with a game that's more rules light, my experiments are going to be more thematic in nature, I guess. And I kind of play with how I'm narrating, and I focus less on math experiments and, how many phases should this boss have? How much, how big should this city be? How many taverns are there? It's like, I don't get as much into that minutia. It's more thematic and setting experiments.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully this is going to take up a large chunk because there's several things there that I want to pick up on. Let's start with, well, let me, for the benefit of the listeners and mainly so you can remind me when I inevitably forget about it. So I want to talk about experimenting in D&D 5e for the first part here. So your experiences, what you do, what you get out of it, what bits you experiment with and why you do it. And then I want to move on to that dichotomy between what you just described of I'm doing like a maths experiment, I'm literally theory crafting, I think is quite a nice appropriate term for it, versus experimenting in the theme or the story, or I want to see how this story plays out is quite a vastly different beast. So that's what I want to come to later on, and listeners can tell me off for forgetting about it in 30 or so minutes. But before then, let's talk about 5e then, and I'm glad you mentioned that you do experiment in it, because one of my questions was going to be like, how do you do that? And that I definitely do that, and I'm super happy because it's very easy to conceal experimentation to the players. I find maybe that's a benefit of all these books and all these rules and getting bogged down in the details, is that it's this mist between what the players experience and the magic that I'm trying out for the first time.
Yeah. Well, in D&D, I guess in role-playing in general, but specifically to D&D, I kind of view game mastering as like a multidisciplinary art form that rewards those who experiment with new avenues of self-expression. And whether that's on the visual side, whether you're creating new visual media, map making, building props, painting up miniatures, terrain crafting, or even costume making if you want to show up to your table in a wizard's robe or something. Or it could be set and setting stuff like music and lighting, adding sound effects, even stuff like choosing food and beverages to have at the table. Like at my heavy metal campaign, we drink our beverages from these huge metal tankards or steins. And it's just it puts us in the mood for like a very intense heavy metal mood. And then stylistically, you can even experiment there with like how linear or how sandbox do you want to go, thematic choices, like our choice with the heavy metal campaign to really focus on the music first and kind of be very forward with our inspiration of like utilizing heavy metal music as a source of inspiration. And then, campaign structure choices, like are we doing arcs, are we doing chapters, or are we just going to go free form, long form, short form, all those things. Specific to this campaign, I've done some experimenting with the music, which the conventional wisdom is music should be without lyrics, preferably. It should be subdued, or at least not distracting, and then played in the background at a respectable volume where you're not going to be yelling over it. But since I was approaching this from the heavy metal angle, I was like, I want the music to kind of be more front and center than that. And I actually allowed the players to choose themes for their characters. Like our warlock chose Deadly Nightshade by The Sword as their main theme. And his battle theme is Black Tongue by Mastodon. And then he even chose a sad theme, which was the song Helpless by Witchcraft. And the way that I use these music pieces in the game is I kind of, whenever there's a moment that is of significant weight, someone important dies, a mighty enemy is felled, that's when the music can kind of swell. And you get, I kind of take a step back from narration and just kind of let the music tell the story for a little while. So that was a major experiment in that campaign. And I went against conventional wisdom, and I feel like I've been rewarded for it. It's kind of made me think about using music differently in D&D. And my players seem to really enjoy it as well.
Yeah, I too have playlists, some of which are there to evoke a certain emotion. but haven't ever. It is more tricky remotely because pesky players, are in control of how loud the music is if you're playing through like a Discord bot or the web browser or whatnot, and they can always just turn that down. But that's something to think. I know there's an indie, and a couple of my friendship groups on Twitter. There's a couple of guys from the UK indie game that have just done their first. They used Kickstarter to do their first TTRPG, Motorcycle Nights Halcyon Days, which is heavily. I haven't seen it, but it is heavily focused on music. Like music again is drives, but it's more of a 80s 90s vibe rather than a heavy metal kind of vibe. But it is again, it's like you pick a song that defines your character. And so on and so on. And so that's clearly something that happens now. Now I've got two anecdotes two examples to pull on. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's the tricky thing is like I don't know whether my players would even bother. Like if I asked them to think about it, I'd probably get one response, and then 2 months later maybe another response, and then I would give up asking them. Might be worth trying.
Well, I will support this as a possibility for people who. You could run 100 campaigns and only one of them be themed around a genre of music. Mm-hmm. So it's not a experiment that I would use in another game, perhaps. But for this specific campaign, it's such a useful tool. Like just the song choices, they tell a lot about the character that I might not get from a 3-page backstory. Mm-hmm. You know, there's emotions that the music evokes that it would be very difficult as just an amateur person writing some facts on a sheet about your character. That might not capture. Mm-hmm. So I think it does add a depth to the characters. And also because this is a heavy metal game, my kind of mantra is always like, how do I turn this scene up to 11? How do I make this more epic, more over the top? And the music is a big part of that. Some other things that I've done is, and this is more in the mechanical side, which is what you were initially curious about, mm-hmm. is every battle that I put before the players, I try to add mechanics that are more than just beat up the enemy until they have 0 hit points. Mm-hmm. Our first encounter in this campaign was the parties had these kind of hang glider / glide suits that they glided down onto the back of this giant flying whale because one of the players in his backstory was a sky whaler. And I thought, what a cool way to start this out. We're beginning the campaign on a flying city. They skydive down onto the back of this whale. Now, the fight was a pretty typical level 1 fight. You know, you had a couple of orcs and a few other humanoids that they were battling against, mm-hmm. but the battlefield itself was part of the encounter. The giant whale itself had 4 hearts, and in order to make this whale crash to the earth, they needed to stop 2 of its hearts. And to top it all off, this whale would rotate and move through the air. So sometimes the battlefield would go 90 degrees on its side, mm-hmm. and orcs would be falling off of its back and just cascading down to the earth into oblivion. And the whale also had a big storm cannon strapped to its back because the whale was in control or was being controlled by some whale riders. So this storm cannon played an environmental hazard factor. So they were not only on a tilting and moving environment fighting these orcs, but they were also avoiding the range of this laser cannon that could basically kill them in one shot. Wow. So, that was a very difficult encounter to balance because it's hard to factor in like, okay, what if the players don't secure themselves to the whale when it turns on its side? Do I just tell them to scoop up their character sheet and see you next week? Or what do I do? And it took a lot of just trust in the players to mm-hmm. let go of that control. And during the battle, an NPC died who was of significant importance to one of the players' backstories. It was the whaling captain. He was vaporized by the storm cannon in like the 3rd round of combat. And it was just a very unceremonious, unfortunate death. And I had probably 2 pages of notes about this guy in my binder that are just now in the recycling bin. So if you run an encounter as risky as that, you have to be prepared to make those hard decisions and just be like, yep, that's what happened. So we live by the sword and die by the sword.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you experiment, there's always a risk of it exploding to various degrees, to use a science analogy there. I kick myself because I always go on this show, oh yeah, it's great, do your encounters, like the environmental things and are very important, makes it exciting, and then never do it myself because I'm an idiot and always forget about it and leave it to the last minute and focus too much on building the combatants. I think I've done rough terrain, but I really need to do like moving terrain, or I need to crib from other games and board games. Like when you first said they were parachuting down, I had the idea that maybe they were, maybe the combat could have started while they were wing gliding down, and like every round they're forcibly moved 60 foot to the left because that's just them. Like they have to glide forward because you're gliding. You can't just turn around and go back. Like you have to kind of have that forward momentum, some kind of forced movement or something. And having the whale rotate gave me Breath of the Wild vibes when you're in the beasts, especially the bird in the air that you rotate the body and it changes the 90 degrees, which is great. A pain in the ass to like map if you have to like draw a map because it takes me long enough to do just like a static 2D town square, let alone anything exotic. But it's definitely what I want to do.
To resolve the landing, I had each player make a dexterity check, and it was, I usually do kind of a pass fail and not like a stratified check, but in this case I used a stratified dex check, and below a certain threshold I got to place their mini on the whale wherever I wanted it to be, and I'd put them in very inconvenient places if they scored poorly.
Yeah.
And then if they scored well, then they got to hand select where they landed. And if they scored badly enough, then they suffered tremendous injury landing haphazardly on the whale. So I think it was a missed opportunity. I could have had them engage while they were still airborne. I think that's a cool idea. I may have to borrow that if they end up hunting another sky whale.
To be honest, with what you've already got, that might have been overkill on top. But it's a good opportunity to use it again going forward in a similar situation. Or at least like imagine how many video games is there like a section where you're falling and you can like fight like anime and stuff when you're like fighting in the air. Like that would be sick to do a fight where all the combatants are falling until the warlock casts fly and goes, I'm not going to be part of this fight anymore. Bye.
Yeah.
But that's still a very ticking clock. Like you have to do it before you hit the ground, and then you have to deal with hitting the ground at some point as well. So
yeah, absolutely. That was a big risk putting this fight in the air at low level because I kind of have a policy. I roll openly as a DM, and I don't provide plot armor to my NPCs, obviously, or to my players either. So if someone were to fail a dex check at a critical moment when the whale was rotating, or they were standing in the path of the storm cannon, I just kind of had to go into this fight knowing the risk that I could lose one or all of the party. And without that risk, I don't think that the scene is as intense. So that was another kind of experiment, was like pushing an encounter to a point where it could or possibly even should have been a TPK, and then just letting the dice make the decisions.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you say you roll in the open as well. That is another thing that I like literally live experimented with my current game. I went first 30, 40 sessions of traditional DMing with the screen and behind the screen. And then since doing the show, especially there's an episode earlier on, season 1 on fudging, when I was like, you know what, almost from a laziness point of view, I was like, I don't really want to have the meta decision of like, do I save this NPC or not, or do I make this enemy hit or miss when they've just crit or something? I'm like, I don't want to have to deal with that anymore. So I'm just going to roll in the open, and it just happens what it happens. And now I've just taken off all of that burden on me to now I'm like, this is great. I don't have to care anymore. Like if they hit, they hit. If he dies, he dies. Like that's it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I kind of wrestled with the decision momentarily for D&D as to whether or not I wanted to use hidden information in that way or not. And I understand the argument for both sides. It's like, well, it's another tool in the toolkit. Sometimes you want to make a roll and not tell the players what it's for, like enemies who are acting in secret or other things. It's kind of, you don't want to give them too much meta information by rolling, and then you're like, yep, well, something happened. I'm not going to tell you what it was. So I see the advantages to hiding it, but I also think that the added weight of showing the dice, it kind of allows the players to know that the threats are real, or at least they're real to their characters, and that nobody's going to save them other than themselves and their wits. So
yeah, it's all honest. They can trust you not to pull any BS and Even if you do crit 4 times in a row, you can be like, well, that's not me with a vendetta. Like that is what it is. Like, I'm sorry. Yeah, I feel just as bad for you as you feel right now.
Absolutely.
One thing this conversation has done is made me go, I don't experiment enough. Certainly with my combat encounters, I definitely need to think a little bit more outside the box with varying. I don't know whether the way I do it is maybe the way I approach campaign design is very like all the fights tend to be just on ground level or in a place where it doesn't make sense to have a lava flow moving through or steam vents or a landslide. It is very much like. I'm trying to I could have maybe done more on my last one, which was the one before I started streaming, where they were in like a scrap yard essentially. So the ground was just littered with, you're basically playing in a junkyard. I think it was difficult terrain, but apart from that, maybe I could have leveraged more there, been more experimental. But I'm just trying to think of is there any opportunity coming up where I could have interesting encounters? Like I'm playing in a couple of days' time, actually, Gloomhaven, the board game. Regular listeners will know. And that, certainly some of the side scenarios in that have got exotic terrain effects. We played one, last time we played, there was one where there are rocks. It is a landslide. It's like at the lowest initiative, a row of rocks moves down the map. And if they move into the space that your character is in, you take X damage and get pushed to the side. So you can obviously manipulate the enemies to be in the path of the rocks, or you can, use them to block off a part of the thing if you position yourself correctly, and so on and so on. And then another side scenario played was there is strong winds, your storm peak or something. It's very evocative, and every round you roll a d4 essentially to work out which direction the wind's blowing, and all the characters move 2-3 squares, 2-3 hexes in that direction, cardinal direction. And so you can again try and hedge your bets and hope you move them into a trap or so on and so on. Right. So like I have enough examples, so I don't know why I don't do more of that stuff.
It's tricky stuff. Like I only recently, I would say probably in the last couple of years, started working more with 3D terrain, an experiment where I was originally using styrofoam and cardboard and stuff to craft topographical maps and just kind of representations of the towns and locales that my players were visiting. I was like, well, I'm chopping all this foam up. Why don't I just make interactive 3-dimensional terrain for my battles? And so that level of production, it's a lot more difficult than just drawing on the graph paper and just putting down a 2D map. And the time commitment can be I don't know, that sometimes I'll spend hours on one of these maps. And if my players, I tend to give my players a lot of choice, and they kind of have the ability to just be like, well, we're not going there. And I'm like, cool. And the map stays in the basement and I save it for another campaign. So, I mean, that's kind of, I would say, the con of taking on more dynamic terrain, incorporating cardboard and styrofoam and paint. It's just like, if you're giving your players a certain degree of freedom, you have to be ready to leave those in the basement or in the closet, and they may never see the light of day, which is heartbreaking, but it's just, it's part of the deal.
It's less of an impact if it's just a cool idea you had once. Okay, fine. I can probably reuse that cool idea, recolored, palette swapped somewhere else. But if it's 6 hours of building a cityscape that city is now destroyed, well, that's a different matter entirely. Like, maybe you could rebuild that city somewhere else, but you can't just palette swap that easily. That's At the beginning of the campaign, I had the benefit of kind of placing the characters in the world where I wanted them to be, so I could pretty much guarantee that they were going to jump down to this whale. They still had the freedom to just not if they wanted to, but it's like, come on, who's not going to skydive down to a whale? So I kind of dangled that carrot and kind of put them on with their toes over the edge of the city to get us started. And so I knew I wasn't going to regret having like a 3-foot by 1-foot styrofoam whale map. And then, since we'd established in our world building that flying whales were a thing, I was like, even if they just say, screw this, I'm not taking the risk. I know a flying whale may show up at some point, so it's not going to be a waste of time. You should have had it on a hog roast, so you could have done the rotation. that you were saying. If you didn't, now that's a
wow.
lost opportunity.
That is, oh my gosh. Next time. I still have the whale and I can always adjust it. So I mentioned just a second ago that we established sky whales and sky whaling in the world. And another experiment that kind of was born of this campaign is something that was inspired by Adventure Zone's Ether Sea, where before the campaign started, they had a prologue where they used these prompts from cards that led them through a series of questions and moments in the setting's history that let the players collaborate with the game master to make the world. So I kind of stole that idea, made up my own prompts on various cards, and during session 0, instead of building characters, we built the world. So we went through the prompts. Every character or every player got a stack of these cards and kind of got to choose how the world developed. And I relinquished all control. They were coming up with all the factions. They even made the landscape and placed significant threats on the map. Or we had one card that was a prompt that says, "Wait, who's in this game?" And I told them that prompt allows you to take a character or a concept from popular media and just stick it somewhere on the map. And they chose Sasquatch. So now Sasquatch is a real thing that is in my game somewhere in the middle of a forest. So that experiment, it's continuing to pay off. I think that letting the players build the world improves buy-in. I think it helps them remember the lore better because it's not just them sitting there listening to you read them a short story. They created the story. So they have a better grasp of all the ins and outs of the world because their fingerprints are all over it. I also think that it hasn't paid off yet because this campaign is still pretty young, but I think there's a big opportunity for callbacks that are very satisfying where someone's like, "Oh, I made up that NPC," or "Oh, that's a civilization that I had creative control over." So that pride of authorship is going to make those big callbacks, or those moments where they're like, "Oh, that's what that city looks like that I plopped down on the map, several months ago." So that experiment is in progress. And so far I haven't detected any cons other than perhaps there may be a little bit less mystery about the world because the players were so integral in its creation. So it's going to be less of a discovery of things that they have no concept of. Now they're going to be discovering things that they created.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard people do similar things before, and you're absolutely right about the improves buy-in. I mean, I know it would with me, certainly, be in that situation. That is my next step. As I said, step 1 was me being less precious about data and information. Step 2 is then being like, here are the reins, players, to the world. Which is a bit of a bigger cherry to pop for me.
Sure.
But absolutely, it will help. And you can very much fall into the trap. I've done it. I've been guilty of being that DM that's just like, 1,000 years ago, this happened, and you don't know a lot about this, and green dragons are a thing here that now you know, or you did know originally, and it is just kind of like two-dimensional in a way. I'm struggling for the words to describe it, but it is very much like, oh, okay, I'm having information poured into my brain, whereas as you can see the difference from when they've put green dragons in that location. They can be like, oh, cool, I see now. I'm excited for what's coming up.
I do think that there's a kind of change in the paradigm of what your creative burden is as the DM, because now you're no longer just pulling things from the vapor or from popular media and mashing them all together to make something. The players have given you the gifts, they've given you the clay and kind of told you what they expect in the world. They're like, this is how the world works. And then it's up to you to execute. So your creative energy, instead of going into like synthesis, is now on execution. So the fact that they said, yeah, I'm a sky whaler. Like at first they were a whaler, and then he was like, no, I'm a sky whaler. I hunt flying whales. And then initially they were like, hey, there's these big serpents in the sky called Ouroboros. And there are these serpents that are so large that a city could exist on their back. And they soar through the sky on these weird helical patterns across the skies. And it's like, I was like, wow, that sounds so cool. And then in the back of my mind, I'm like, now I have to figure out how to make that work. So all of my creative energy is like, how do I make a flying circular city make sense? And how do I make sky whaling make sense? And there's a lot of examples where they just handed me a gift where they asked this is what we want. Now do it. And some of it's pretty daunting. Like the ultimate weapon in this world is the dark saber from Star Wars.
Okay.
If you're familiar with The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a player decision. They were like, hey, the ultimate weapon should be the dark saber. And I'm like, cool. And they're like, and we want it to be super unattainable and hard to get. And I was like, totally. That's a great idea. And then they were like, and there's a series of challenges and puzzles that lead to this thing. And nobody's been able to solve it for 1,000 years. And in the back of my mind, I'm going, okay, so now I have to make a series of puzzles and challenges that nobody has been able to solve for 1,000 years. It has to be plausible that no one could solve this for 1,000 years, but it has to be not only engaging and fun, but possible for my players to solve these challenges and ultimately get the Darksaber one day, hopefully.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it's very easy to say, make a series of impossible challenges, but to actually have to execute on that is a massive challenge. So maybe that is one of the cons of turning over the reins completely, is that you never know what your players are going to give you and say, execute on this.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely a razor's edge of, you need to find the lost tomb. Oh, we found it. Ding dong, it's here. Like that, bridging that gap is difficult. Like to keep it making sense, but also have that sense of reward is hard. Like, and that obviously the higher the players get, the trickier it is, because they're access to more stuff that can just bypass 80% of what you do, and so on and so on. But yeah, having that verisimilitude of and again, the other problem there is obviously you're dealing with human, real people in the real world, humans that you can touch and speak to and have day jobs and stuff. Mm-hmm. And no disrespect, but they're probably not clever enough to solve riddles that no other human has you know, that, like, so it still needs to be kind of within the bounds of human knowledge and understanding for regular folk.
Yeah, it was a massive design challenge, and I have ideas of how I'm going to go about accomplishing this, where it's like, it seems plausible that no one could have solved this for 1,000 years, but this handful of people who are, you know, awesome people, but still relatively ordinary people will be able to accomplish it. But I just can't divulge that today for risk of my players finding out.
I want to come up now we've been talking about, I want to come up with like a series of stuff for like itch.io of almost party game styled world generation methods. Mm-hmm. So what you've just described while we were talking, I was thinking about like a Cards Against Humanity way of doing it. So that you have a black deck and you have a white deck, and one person picks the black deck, and that's the prompt. And then each of the other players have got two choices that they can pick from, a more randomized way of being like, oh, and then that you put them down in the middle, and everyone votes on, or maybe even that, you know, you could do proper Cards Against Humanity, and only the you know, the dealer in that instance gets to pick what goes in, and you can just go around that loop several times and come out with something weird and wacky at the end. I want to come up with like a series of party games for world building that ranges from like completely random to workshopping it with your players. That's now a project that I've given myself, which is great.
That's going to be awesome. I can't wait to see the result of that.
Cool. I'll speak to you in about 5 years. And then drop me a message in 5 years, and then I'll tell you how long is left on it. Have you done any other kind of, I don't know the way to say it, like more traditional experimentation when it comes to 5e then, like using a mummy lord in a certain fashion, or tweaking combat in such a way that it works differently, or some kind of setup or party dynamic or something like that is, you know, and how did that pay off and work? Sure.
I've experimented with different methods of encounter balancing. I feel like just leaning heavily on CR is it's not going to work consistently. Mm-hmm. I feel like CR is a tool, but it would be very difficult to build an entire house with just a hammer. So I think that you kind of need to make use of more than just the CR. Like I tend to use Kobold Fight Club. Mm-hmm. I tend to use action economy as a balancing method. So if the players have multi attack and the monsters don't, well, I'm going to need more monsters, because I think of like an action as like 1 point of action economy, and then, you know, you kind of want the turns to be, you want the players to be slightly outnumbered, if not significantly outnumbered because they have so many crowd control tools and mitigation tools.
Yeah.
So I tend to use a combination of Kobold Fight Club. I use the CR a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I weight enemies that are clumped differently. Sometimes I don't even count them. So if I have a wizard in the party and I have like 10 goblins or something, and the wizard has access to Fireball, those goblins don't even show up in my calculation. It's just there for fun for the wizard to see the destructive power of Fireball.
Yeah.
So a lot of that comes down to experimenting and just trying things and seeing how easy or difficult things are. I know that a surefire way to shoot yourself in the foot is to have the monolithic villain where it's just you and the Lich and your party of adventurers, because even if that Lich has access to legendary actions and layer actions and other things, the action economy is just going to be a landslide against them. So after heartbreaking putting away minis that I spent like hours painting and just being like, well, yeah, that was 2 rounds and now he's going back in the shoebox.
Yep.
So after doing that a couple times, I started to realize, you gotta consider the action economy.
Yeah.
So I would say that's pretty heavy. Effective hit points is a useful thing because if you consider your party's damage output and what kind of types of damage they have access to.
Yeah.
If you give an enemy a resistance to the damage they love to use, then that enemy has double the hit points now. So there's just a lot of factors.
Yeah, single enemy encounters I love and I hate. I love them because it is a rites of passage for pretty much every DM. I've played with the DMs who've done it. I've been the DM who's done it. You've done it. Everyone I speak to is like, yeah, I've shared in that disappointment of having a single big bad guy because I was, inexperienced with combat encounter and thought it would be really cool. And again, that is very much a learning experience and, an experimental phase of bringing in, maybe he has 2 lieutenants, maybe realizing 2's still not enough against a party of 5. And like, okay, then next time around, what do I need to do? And it's that I like education and I like learning and I like seeing people's light bulb moments. So seeing that progress come through is always interesting. And yeah, as I said, I play in games where the DM's done it, and I can see no matter how good their poker face is, I can tell because I've been in that situation. I could be like, yeah, you're kicking yourself now that you've only got one guy. Like I know you are. I know you've probably added about 100 HP in the last 10 seconds just because you've gone, whoops, this has gone completely out the window. So I love it as a shared experience, and I hate it because it's such a shortcoming of it.
Yes, it is.
Such a common pitfall, and that's something I haven't my big bad I haven't planned yet because it's months and months and months away. But that's something that I definitely need to do is consider what their minions, what the extra characters will be in that encounter.
Yes, I agree. I think that having just that monolithic villain, all by themselves, it just at least in this system, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's some part of me that I love to break with status quo and be like, I could make a single villain work. Like I want to challenge it, but I do think that it's a pretty well established experiment. People have tried and failed that one enough times that I think I'm ready to accept science.
I think clearly it is possible, but then you end up essentially running 2 or 3 different creatures, but they're all called the same name and occupy the same space and have access to the same features and have the same HP. So you just basically give them maybe more turns would be a way to do it. But again, that's a bit of a hack.
Sure.
And screams unfairness to the players if they've had however many sessions and hours of enemies that only take 1 action per round, and then suddenly this guy, in addition to maybe legendary actions, and I know there's action-oriented design. I've done that once, and it was kind of okay. It lessened the blow a little bit. That had environmental effects. That had a second phase. Even still, it was still very like 1 versus 6, and it's just it doesn't take a mathematician to work out how one-sided that fight is.
Yeah.
Now I know, listeners, that we've gone over a little bit more than 30 minutes, so let's move on to the other bit there that I wanted to talk about earlier on. Good, I've covered myself now. Is the difference in building and experimenting with different systems. So we've talked about D&D 5e, we've talked at length about the failings and the shortcomings of in encounter-based design, challenge rating design, ways to band-aid that, and so on. And so I wanted to talk about and leverage your experience in other systems and stuff like Tales from the Loop, where it is that narrative experimentation. Like how I can't even begin to think. It seems to me like way more risky on one hand, but also way lower stakes on the other hand. So I'm really struggling to kind of pass what, do you hedge all your bets on like this weird experimental story you want to tell for it to maybe be completely garbage and everyone have a bad time? Like I don't how can you kind of recompense that with still trying to provide a good experience? Like the worst case, what happens if you misjudge a combat encounter in 5e, the players go, well, that was easy and we're super strong and that's cool. Or, we got through that with the skin of our teeth. And then that's it. You have another combat encounter half an hour later and everyone's forgotten about the first one already. Whereas if you try and do some new way of telling a story or some new plot thread, that could just go completely wrong. Or perhaps I'm very naive. I don't know. What are your
No,
thoughts?
You're right. I think that experimenting, especially in like rules light or narrative forward systems, it kind of comes down to trying to lean into the strengths of a system and really like flex the muscles that system has. Like when I'm playing 7th Sea, I experiment with almost a completely different set of personal rules for myself when I'm running that. It's more of a storytelling game.
Mm-hmm.
In the rules, it says it is impossible for the heroes to die and they cannot fail in their quest. It's kind of like the story of how these heroes were awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And a player, I guess it's more accurate to say a player cannot die to anyone except for their arch nemesis. So it's like every single point of that game is focused around delivering a satisfying narrative that kind of fits in your hero's journey, like the heroes rejecting the quest and then reluctantly accepting it, rising to the occasion. The journey changes them in some way and then they overcome evil. And then they either can return home and be like the Samwise, or they have to say, no, this adventure changed me too much and go the way of the Frodo and, sail off. So I would say in 7th Sea, it is very contra to how I would run D&D. I tend to be I lean a little bit more on narrative beats. Villains have more monologues. I focus much more on capturing the feeling of being on a ship. I actually added a system to 7th Sea where each player has a companion crew member, which is an NPC who they have a special relationship with of some kind. Either they're confidants or friends or rivals of some kind. And so they have a character that is on the boat with them. It kind of gives this feeling that the ship is not just the players. There's a whole crew that they are working with during this kind of seafaring adventure. And that's something I would never do for D&D. I feel like DMPCs are, I mean, I've had a lot of failed experiments with the DMPCs and I've seen DMPCs kind of go nuclear and kind of take up a lot more table time than they need to. But in the context of 7th Sea, where we're telling the story of this crew who's fighting against all odds and they've kind of, become friends, and you want those NPC deaths to have significant weight in the telling of that satisfying narrative of Caroline struck by a stray cannonball, and just have the whole table fall silent. And it's like you're kind of trying to milk out those moments, whereas in D&D I very much let the system tell the story, and I don't guide the players through narrative beats. I just kind of roll the dice and see where they may land. I would also say that the action sequences in 7th Sea are more the players have more power to describe what they're doing and kind of tell you, I spend one success to swing from the chandelier, leap onto the villain's back, and drive my rapier through his heart. And you're just like, yep, you did that, because they're spending successes and there is no way for them to fail in what they're doing. There are combat rules and stuff in 7th Sea, but a lot of them are very broad strokes, very simplified. Yeah. And the conceit of the game is, of course, that the heroes win. So that to me was playing in that system was a massive experiment to me because it kind of went against, my years with systems like Shadowrun, where dying an unceremonious and silly death is like part of the game. You show up with 2 character sheets just because you know that you're probably going to, trigger a trap, or a mage is going to blow you up with a fireball or something. Yeah. The deadliness of those other systems kind of changes the vibe.
Yeah. I one thing that I've learned after this, 50 minutes or so, is that I definitely need to experiment with other systems. I've had my Against the Dark Master. I've had my Tales from the Loop. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to try Delta Green, but that certainly piqued my interest as well.
Yeah.
That's something I want to try. D100 for Delta Green, is that correct?
I believe it's a percentile roll under system.
Yes, yeah. So that's, again, I think Against the Dark Master was similar, but it was such a light touch. I didn't, it's hard to kind of get a real grasp on how it works. So yeah, that my main takeaway from this episode is I want to try more TTRPGs, and I want to tell my listeners that honestly, I haven't had that light bulb moment for ages. When I had that in Tales from the Loop of that, I go to the video store on VHS, the Blockbuster, and go and pick up a thing, and me going just sitting there like a lemon. I hope I didn't come across like I was a bit dumbfounded, and then I had to like bring myself back in because I was like, oh. That's that. Okay, they've gone. This isn't fantasy, sword and board, wilderness, danger lurks around every corner, and a wizard might blow you up at the drop of a hat. This is something completely different, and that is what I want to encourage other people to try and have those experiences too.
Yeah, I agree that the dynamics just between systems can be vastly different. As kind of I understand why people don't play other systems. There is a large barrier to entry where it comes to player selection. So I have a bookshelf over to my left here, just off camera, that is packed with role-playing game systems that I can't wait to play. Mm-hmm. But you kind of have to make that sales pitch to the players, like, hey, this may or may not be fun. we're gonna like have to learn a system. You may have to buy a book or something, or at least download a PDF for a quick start guide. And like that kind of inertia is very difficult to overcome. And once someone has a lot of effort sunk into a given system, like my experience DMing Dungeons and Dragons, I've been playing D&D since Advanced D&D 2nd edition, I want to say. So a lot of those wisdoms and stories and all that stuff, like it's difficult to leverage that in a system like 7th Sea, where it's a seafaring adventure where the heroes have to win. And you're just describing how cool they are when they win. Mm-hmm. And trying to kind of get the drama comes from the political intrigue or like how it gets done. It's not so much a will it get done. So I don't know. I think it's hard for people to overcome that barrier where they're like, well, am I going to throw away these like 7 to maybe even 20 years of experience with D&D to try something else, like this anime themed game where we're all, playing children catching monsters and battling them against each other. Like, I understand people's barrier to entry. Yeah.
And it's that initial inertia as well. It's like, hey, this first session, we're going to be fumbling our way through and it'll probably suck. But let's, that kind of joint effort to power through is tricky. And now I'm concerned that TTRPGs are going to turn into my other hobby, like board games, where I have in my chest of drawers downstairs off camera, I have a chest of drawers full of board games that are gathering dust because we were playing like one routinely and that's that evening done. And because pesky life stops us from meeting more often, like we don't get a chance. Like, again, we have to learn the rules. We have to have that first game that will take 2.5 times longer than it should do, really, because you have to stop every 30 seconds to read the rules. That is such an uphill battle. But I want to tell people to at least consider it.
I agree. I mean, I've kind of been lucky in that several of my gaming groups were very open to the idea of playing different games. Like I've played Aberrant, Conan, Fate. We played Tales from the Loop. I've played several of the Star Wars role-playing games, Alien. Like the list goes on. And none of that would happen if I didn't have like a thriving gaming community and some close friends who were willing to experiment with those other systems with me and try it out. So not everyone is as lucky, and I know that can be tough, but
Absolutely.
there are a lot of rewards to be reaped from trying new things. And if you have the community that'll support it, you should try it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you wanted to get to, you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I have a couple of boundary pushing weird things that I've experimented with that I thought would be interesting to bring up.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I started with my 7th Sea campaign, and it's kind of bled into my D&D play as well, is incorporating out-of-game elements to affect in-game outcomes. And conventional wisdom says never do this.
Oh, yeah.
It's immersion breaking. It's it's taking the focus away from the character sheet, and it's kind of, incorporating challenges that are outside the game to affect the in-game results can have negative consequences, and I acknowledge that. But I also know that it does have a lot of pros. So, for example, during my 7th Sea campaign, there was a festival going on, and the crew visited this festival, and there was a series of competitions, including a singing competition. So, as part of resolving their success at the singing competition, I allowed them to add modifiers to their score in a karaoke contest. So the modifier came from their skills, from their character sheet.
Yeah.
And then the resolution was we went to the YouTube, pulled open a karaoke video, and let them choose the song and sing it in front of everyone. And then the other players kind of give them a 1 to 10 score on their singing performance, and then you add your performance skill on top.
Wow.
Now, that was a super fun session. Was it immersion breaking? Yeah, it definitely was. And for some, that's a deal breaker because, the simulation, focusing on immersion and escapism is like king. But for this 7th Sea game, that wasn't my goal. My goal was just to max out fun and just kind of go wild with it. So the karaoke contest was one thing. I've used Nerf guns to resolve archery contests before. I've made puzzles with like a prop element. So I've kind of like made things that the players can fiddle with at the table and try and solve the puzzle as people. And then when they solve it on the table, then they've solved it in the game. And in my heavy metal campaign, I made use of arm wrestling. One of my players was trying to get into a little bit of a bar scuffle, and he challenged the shadiest looking man in the room to an arm wrestling match for information. Mm-hmm. And I said, cool, we can either do a contested strength roll here, or you can literally arm wrestle me. And the player elected to arm wrestle me.
Yes.
And so I think that those things are a lot of fun. They're really engaging. Mm-hmm. I do acknowledge the drawbacks, and I have no illusions that this is something I would recommend for every table. But without pushing the envelope and doing weird stuff like that, you just never know.
Yeah.
So I encourage people to get weird with it. Pull out your foam cutters and paints and make some 3D maps. Arm wrestle your players if you want to. Start playing, heavy metal music if it's appropriate for your campaign, and just kind of have fun with it.
Oh man, I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot now for getting over an hour in, and that's when we start talking about karaoke.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Is there anything you would like to promote?
Yes. My podcast is called the Hidden GMs Podcast. It's an interview show, as I mentioned, and you can find it at hiddengmspodcast.com. I'm at Hidden GMs on Twitter, and I'd be happy to hear your comments about any of my weird approaches to playing D&D, and of course, correct me on any of the mistakes I've made describing the 7th Sea system or anything else I've aired on. That's fine. I welcome those comments. And please reach out to me if you want to.
Awesome. The only thing that left then is for me to say thank you very much for your time today, Nick. That was awesome. Very interesting. And for the listeners at home, Nick did know this going in, but this is a second episode in my series of not doing any preparation. An experiment, you might say, on the podcast format, and I hope it went okay.
Well, Danlo, I had a blast, and I would say the experiment was a success. I really enjoyed speaking with you this fine day, as well as playing with you during the stream. So thanks.
Awesome. No worries. Thank you very much again. As usual, all links will be in the episode description, including the charity stream Nick and I were on a few weeks back. I would encourage you to go and check that out, as that was, maybe you'll be able to spot the dumbfound light bulb moment. So if you want to see that happen, you can do. Otherwise, Thank you all for listening, and good night. And now it's time for the Patreon shoutouts. Thank you to Robert Hartley, DM for Viva la Dirt League and writer on the D&D Logic web series. I would encourage everybody to check him out at Robert Hartley GM on Twitter and Twitch. Thank you to Optional Rule, a two-time guest of the show and a very insightful and knowledgeable source of information. Please check them out at www.optionalrule.com. Huge thank you to a great friend of the show, Matthew Perkins, who's out there making hilarious and educational Dungeons & Dragons content. Please go and check out his stuff at matthewperkins.net, where you can find links to all of his socials and all of his content, including his own Patreon, which I would very much encourage you to check out. Thank you to Matt Street at mpstreet88 on Twitter for supporting the show. If you need support running your personal or business schedule, head to virtualtimehustle.com or on Instagram to make that difference between should do and done. Boss it better with support from Kat, who will help you get back that essential time you've been searching for. If you would like to support what we do and get 4 shout-outs a month, head over to patreon.com/thinkingcritically, or you can just buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/thinkingcritically